She was the most wanted woman in Nazi-occupied France, a 5 million franc bounty on her head. The Gestapo called her the White Mouse because no matter how carefully they set their traps, she always slipped through their fingers like smoke through a keyhole. By day, she was a charming socialite sipping champagne in Parisian cafes. By night, she was a ghost haunting the backroads of occupied France, shepherding Allied airmen to safety, building networks of resistance that would help liberate a nation. From the glittering salons of 1930s Paris to the killing fields of the French resistance, Nancy Wake's story is one of the most extraordinary transformations in the history of warfare. A woman who traded her pearl necklaces for plastic explosives, her evening gowns for guerrilla fatigues, her comfortable life for a death sentence. How did a party girl become a predator? How did elegance become lethality? And how did one woman's courage help change the course of World War II? You're listening to Tales from the Timeline, and this is the story of the White Mouse. In the glittering salons of 1930s Paris, where champagne flowed like water and the jazz never stopped, Nancy Wake danced through her days with the careless grace of someone who believed the world was hers to conquer. The Australian girl, who had fled poverty in Sydney, now moved through the city of light like a creature born to its boulevards. Her laughter echoing off the high ceilings of fashionable apartments, her auburn hair catching the light of crystal chandeliers. But beneath the surface of this intoxicating life, something darker was stirring across Europe. Nancy had come to Paris as a journalist, her sharp mind and fearless spirit perfectly suited to the work of uncovering stories. She had married Henri Fiocca, a wealthy French industrialist, in 1939, and together their life seemed charmed until the world began to crack beneath their feet. The journey that would change everything began with a simple assignment. Nancy travelled to Vienna in 1933, her press credentials opening doors that remained closed to ordinary tourists. The city that had once waltzed to Johann Strauss now marched to a different rhythm entirely. The streets that should have been filled with music were instead filled with something else. Fear, thick and palpable as morning fog. What Nancy witnessed in Vienna would haunt her for the rest of her life. She saw Jewish shopkeepers forced to scrub the streets with toothbrushes while stormtroopers stood over them, laughing. She watched as old men were beaten for the crime of existing, their blood mixing with the dirty water on the cobblestones. The elegant cafes where intellectuals once debated philosophy now stood empty, their windows shattered like broken promises. The woman who had floated through Parisian society like a butterfly suddenly found herself transformed. The frivolity that had once defined her existence now seemed not just meaningless but obscene. How could she return to cocktail parties and fashion shows when such horrors were unfolding just across the border? How could she dance while others suffered? Nancy threw herself into her journalism with newfound purpose. Her articles about the rising Nazi threat became more urgent with each passing month. But even as she documented the growing darkness, she knew that words alone would not be enough. The party girl was dying, and something harder, more dangerous was being born in her place. When war finally came to France in 1940, Nancy watched her adopted country crumble with the speed of a house of cards. The German war machine rolled across the countryside like a steel tide, crushing everything in its path. The comfortable world she had known, the world of dinner parties and gallery openings, vanished overnight, replaced by something altogether more terrible. The France that emerged from the wreckage was divided, wounded, occupied. The Vichy government collaborated with their conquerors while ordinary French citizens learned to live with the rationing, curfews, and constant presence of Wehrmacht soldiers on their streets. For many, survival meant keeping one's head down, asking no questions, and making no trouble. But Nancy Wake was not like many people. As she moved through occupied France, she began to see the resistance forming in the shadows, the brave souls who refused to accept defeat. British airmen shot down over France needed help escaping to safety. Jewish families required false papers and safe passage. The Underground Railroad of human courage was already beginning to form. The transformation was complete when Nancy made her choice. She would not be a bystander to history. She would not watch from the sidelines as evil triumphed. The party girl who had once worried about which dress to wear to the opera now concerned herself with more urgent matters: how to forge identity papers, how to create safe houses, how to move people across borders without being detected. Her husband Henri supported her decision, though he knew the terrible risks involved. To help the resistance meant to invite death to their home, to transform their comfortable existence into something perpetually dangerous. Every knock on the door might be the Gestapo. Every friendly face might hide an informer. Every day might be their last. But Nancy had found her calling. The woman who had once lived for pleasure now lived for something far more important. The chance to strike back at the machinery of oppression, to help others find freedom in a world gone mad. She was no longer Nancy Wake, the socialite. She was becoming something else entirely, something the Germans would soon learn to fear. The White Mouse was about to be born. By 1940, Nancy Wake had become a ghost haunting the back roads of occupied France. The woman who had once been the life of every party now moved through the shadows like smoke, appearing and disappearing with an almost supernatural ability to evade capture. The Gestapo had given her a code name that would become legend: the White Mouse. Because no matter how carefully they set their traps, she always seemed to slip through their fingers. The escape network that Nancy had helped establish stretched across France like an invisible web, connecting safe houses from the English Channel to the Pyrenees. British and Allied airmen, shot down over occupied territory, would find themselves passed from hand to hand. A farmer's cottage here, a priest's cellar there, a shopkeeper's back room. Each stop carefully chosen, each handler risking death for the chance to strike back at the occupation. Nancy's role in this network was crucial. Her ability to speak perfect French, combined with her quick thinking, her unshakable nerve, made her invaluable as a courier. She would collect downed airmen from their hiding places, armed with false identity papers and cover stories that would mean the difference between life and death. An RAF pilot became a deaf-mute cousin visiting from Provence. An American bomber crew member transformed into a farmhand recovering from tuberculosis. The journeys were exercises in controlled terror. Nancy would guide her charges through train stations crawling with German patrols, past checkpoints where a single wrong answer could expose them all. She developed an almost supernatural ability to read the intentions of ununiformed men who scrutinized their papers, knowing instinctively when to smile, when to flirt, and when to become invisible. On one memorable occasion, Nancy found herself sharing a train compartment with a German officer who seemed unusually interested in her travelling companion, a young British pilot posing as her tubercular brother. The officer's questions grew more probing with each mile, and Nancy could see the sweat beading off the airman's forehead despite the cool weather. With the casual grace of someone discussing the weather, she began to flirt with the German, distracting him so completely that he forgot all about the nervous young man in the corner. By the time they reached their destination, the officer was so smitten that he helped Nancy carry her brother's luggage, personally escorting them through the station checkpoint without so much as glancing at their papers. The pilot later said it was the most terrifying and impressive performance he'd ever witnessed. But Nancy's work extended far beyond playing escort to downed airmen. She helped establish safe houses across southern France, creating a network of ordinary citizens willing to risk everything for the cause of freedom. A baker who hid escaped prisoners in his flour storage room. A seamstress who sewed secret compartments into coats for carrying documents. Or a postman who carried messages between resistance cells along his regular route. The Gestapo files on Nancy Wake grew thicker with each passing month. They knew she was operating in their territory, could sense her presence like hunters tracking an elusive prey. Her photograph appeared on wanted posters throughout occupied France, offering rewards that would have made a family wealthy for life. But somehow she always stayed one step ahead. The close calls became more frequent as the net tightened. Nancy would arrive at a safe house only to find German vehicles parked outside, forcing her to abandon her mission and find another route. She learned to travel with multiple sets of identity papers, to change her appearance at a moment's notice, to sleep with one eye open and her escape route always planned. The pressure was taking its toll on everyone in the network. Friends and colleagues began to disappear, arrested in dawn raids or betrayed by informers. The Gestapo's torture methods were becoming more sophisticated, more effective at breaking down even the strongest spirits. Nancy knew that her luck would not hold forever, that eventually the hunters would corner their prey. The moment came in 1943, when Nancy barely escaped a raid on one of her safe houses. She'd been meeting with other resistance members when the black car surrounded the building. Only her quick thinking and knowledge of the building's layout saved her. She escaped through a bathroom window while the Gestapo searched room by room below. But the escape came at a terrible cost. Several of her colleagues were captured, and Nancy knew they would be tortured for information about the network. She had to assume that her cover was blown, that her time in France was over. The White Mouse had become too visible, too dangerous to everyone around her. The decision to leave France was agonizing. Nancy's husband Henri refused to go with her, insisting that his business obligations required him to stay. He promised to follow her later, once he'd settled his affairs. It was a decision that would haunt them both. Henri would be arrested by the Gestapo just months after Nancy's escape, tortured and executed for his role in the resistance. Nancy's final escape from France was a nightmare journey through the Pyrenees Mountains, guided by Spanish smugglers who knew every goat path and hidden cave. For days, she climbed through treacherous terrain, her elegant hands bloodied by rocks, her feet blistered in shoes never meant for mountain climbing. Behind her, the Gestapo's manhunt continued, but ahead lay Spain, and beyond that, freedom. When she finally crossed the border into Spain, Nancy Wake was no longer the woman who had fled Paris months earlier. The White Mouse had been forged in the crucible of occupied France, tempered by danger and loss into something harder and more dangerous. She had helped hundreds of Allied personnel escape to safety and had built a resistance network that would continue to operate long after her departure. But even as she made her way to London, Nancy knew the war for her was far from over. The White Mouse had escaped the trap, but she would return, and when she did, she would bring with her all the skills, all the connections, and all the deadly knowledge she had gained in the shadows. The hunted was about to become the hunter. The converted Halifax bomber cut through the darkness over occupied France, like a knife through black silk. Inside its cramped fuselage, Nancy Wake sat in her heavy parachute harness, her mind focused on the mission ahead. It was April 1944, and after months of training with the British Special Operations Executive, the SOE, she was finally returning to the country that had become her battleground. The SOE had transformed Nancy from a courageous amateur into a professional instrument of warfare. At the secret training facilities in London, she had learned to kill with her bare hands, to operate a radio under fire, to manufacture explosives from household chemicals. The party girl who had once worried about broken fingernails now knew 17 different ways to kill a sentry without making a sound. The red light came on, and Nancy moved towards the aircraft's open hatch. Below her, the French countryside stretched out in the moonlight, a patchwork of fields and forests that looked deceptively peaceful. But she knew better. Down there, the Gestapo waited. Down there, the Wehrmacht patrolled. And down there, her war would continue. Then came the green light she had been anticipating. She stood for a moment, took a deep breath, and then 3, 2, 1, jump. The jump itself was perfect. Nancy had always been athletic, and her training had honed her natural grace into something deadly. She landed in a field near Montluçon, in the heart of the Auvergne region, the parachute collapsing around her like a ghostly flower. Within minutes, she had buried the silk and was moving towards the rendezvous point, every sense alert for danger. The Auvergne region was wild country, all rolling hills and dense forests that provided perfect cover for resistance operations. But it was also a region where different Marquis groups eyed each other with suspicion, where political rivalries sometimes trumped the common cause of fighting Germans. Nancy's mission was to unite these fractious groups under a single command, to forge them into an effective fighting force. Her first meeting with the local resistance leaders took place in a forest clearing, around a campfire that seemed to throw more shadows than light. The men who emerged from the darkness were a diverse group: former soldiers, communist partisans, farmers who had lost everything to German requisitions. They studied Nancy with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. She was, after all, a woman in a world of men, an outsider in a tight-knit community. But Nancy had not returned to France to be polite. She had come with the authority of the SOE and the promise of British support, arms, ammunition, and supplies that could turn the Marquis from a nuisance into a genuine threat. She outlined her plans with the cold precision of a military briefer, her Aussie accent piercing through the stony silence. The radio was Nancy's lifeline to London, her connection to the vast machinery of Allied intelligence. Every night, she would tap out coded messages reporting on German troop movements, requesting supply drops, and coordinating with other resistance cells. The Germans had radio detection equipment that could track transmissions, so each broadcast was a race against time. Get the message out before the enemy triangulated your position. The first arms drop came a week after Nancy's arrival. Containers of weapons and explosives floated down from the sky like deadly Christmas presents. The Marquis gathered the supplies with the enthusiasm of children, their faces lighting up as they examined the Sten guns, the plastic explosives, the detonators that would bring the war to their occupied homeland. Nancy organised the resistance fighters into effective units, teaching them urban guerrilla tactics, showing them how to sabotage German supply lines, how to ambush patrols, how to disappear into the countryside before the enemy could respond. Her training at the SOE had prepared her for this moment, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of leading men into battle. The first major operation was an attack on a German communications centre in a nearby town. Nancy led a team of 12 fighters through the back streets, their faces blackened with coal dust, their weapons checked and rechecked. The plan was simple: infiltrate the building, plant explosives, and withdraw before the Germans knew what had hit them. The attack was a complete success. The communications centre was destroyed, cutting German communications throughout the region for several days. But Nancy knew that success would bring retaliation. The Germans would respond with increased patrols, mass arrests, reprisals against the civilian population. The Marquis would have to be ready for anything. The German response was swift and brutal. Wehrmacht troops flooded into the Auvergne, conducting house-to-house searches, arresting anyone suspected of resistance activities. The Marquis camps came under constant pressure, forced to move deeper into the forest and to change locations almost daily to avoid capture. Days after the operation, the Germans triangulated their radio signals and the primary communication link to London goes dead. The radio operator barely escapes with his life, leaving them isolated and unable to coordinate with Allied command. That's when Nancy makes the decision that will make her a legend. She requisitions a bicycle, an ancient creaking machine that sounds like a rusty gate with every revolution of the wheels. Her destination? A backup radio hidden in a barn 80 kilometers away, across German checkpoints and through territory now crawling with enemy soldiers, hunting for the saboteurs. The journey takes her through the heart of occupied France, She pedals through villages while German soldiers patrol the streets, past checkpoints where one wrong word could mean torture and death. Her papers identify her as a seamstress, travelling to visit a sick aunt. A mundane story that she hopes would be boring enough to avoid scrutiny. At a checkpoint outside Vichy, a German sergeant studies her papers with suspicious eyes. Behind him, she can see wanted posters with sketched faces, her resistance contacts, some of them already captured and executed. He questions her about the contents of her bag, rifling through the sewing supplies that serve as a cover story. She keeps her voice steady, humble, the perfect picture of a French peasant intimidated by German authority. What he doesn't find is the coded message hidden in the lining of her jacket, intelligence about railway targets and German troop movements that could save hundreds of Allied lives. Her papers pass the inspection, and the sergeant waves her through. The barn is exactly where it should be, hidden in a grove of oak trees that stood for centuries. Inside, beneath mouldy hay and rusted farm equipment, she finds the radio. Her fingers work the dials with practiced precision, and suddenly the static clears. London's voice crackles through the ether, strong and clear. She had cycled 500 kilometers to reach the radio, and the relief in the operator's voice was palpable as he acknowledges her transmission. For the first time in weeks, she allows herself a small smile, and she reports the successful operation and confirms that the reception committee is ready for the main event. The message from London was brief but crucial. The D-Day landings were imminent, and the resistance must be ready to support the invasion by disrupting German reinforcements. Nancy knew that this was what she had been preparing for. The moment when all their training, all their sacrifices would be put to the ultimate test. As she prepared her fighters for the battle ahead, Nancy reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The party girl was gone forever, and the white mouse had become a predator. And the hunt was about to begin in earnest. In the weeks leading up to D-Day, Nancy found herself living like a hunted animal, sleeping in different locations each night, always ready to run, always listening for the sound of approaching troops. Her elegant hands became calloused from handling weapons, her designer clothes replaced by the rough garments of a forest fighter. The white mouse had become a guerrilla warrior. But even as pressure mounted, Nancy's network continued to grow. More supplies arrived from London, more local fighters joined the cause. The Marquis began to operate with increasing effectiveness, hitting German convoys, sabotaging rail lines, gathering intelligence on enemy movements. Nancy's reputation spread throughout the region. She was the woman who had come from the sky to lead them to victory. The railway line that snaked through the Auvergne Valley carried more than just trains. It carried the lifeblood of the German war effort. Every day, locomotives pulled cars loaded with troops, ammunition, and supplies headed towards the Normandy beaches where Allied forces had landed just weeks before. Nancy Wake studied the steel ribbons through her binoculars, calculating angles of approach, timing patterns, and weak points in the German defences. The intelligence was precise. A critical supply chain would pass through the valley at 0300 hours, carrying Wehrmacht reinforcements desperately needed to counter the D-Day landings. If Nancy's team could derail this train and destroy the train line, they would cut a vital artery in the German supply network. But the mission would require split-second timing, overwhelming firepower, and nerves of steel. Nancy assembled her strike team in an abandoned farmhouse as the sun set behind the hills. 23 fighters, men who had learned to trust her judgment through months of successful operations. Their faces were grim in the lamplight. They all knew the risks. The rail line was heavily guarded with German patrols, machine gun nests, and searchlights protecting this crucial transportation link. The plan was elegantly simple. Nancy would lead the main assault team, to plant explosive charges on the rail line itself, while two supporting groups would neutralize the German guards and create diversions to cover their escape. The plastic explosives had arrived in the latest supply drop from London, enough C4 to obliterate a quarter-mile section of the track. They moved out at midnight, black shapes flowing through the darkness like water. Nancy had trained them in night movement, teaching them to become invisible in the shadows, to communicate without words, to move as one organism with a single deadly purpose. The moon was dark, providing perfect cover for their approach. The railway cutting appeared before them like a scar in the earth, the steel rails gleaming faintly in the starlight. Nancy could see the German positions. Sandbagged machine gun nests at either end of the bridge, a guard post beside the signal box, searchlights sweeping the approaches in lazy arcs. She counted the enemy, perhaps a dozen soldiers, enough to make the mission dangerous, but not impossible. The first phase began with surgical precision. Nancy's snipers eliminated the searchlight operators with suppressed shots, plunging the railway cutting into darkness. The machine gun nests were next, taken out simultaneously by grenades thrown with deadly accuracy. Within 90 seconds, the German defences had been neutralised. But Nancy knew that the real work was just beginning. The explosions would have alerted every German patrol within miles. They had perhaps 10 minutes before reinforcements arrived. She led her demolition team down into the cutting. Their boots slipped on the loose gravel, their hands already reaching for the charges that would destroy the rail line. The C4 had to be placed with mathematical precision. Too little explosive, and the rails would be damaged but repairable. Too much, and the blast would be visible for miles, drawing every German unit in the region. Nancy had memorized the placement patterns during her SOE training, and her hands moved with practiced efficiency, despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The sound of approaching vehicles sent a chill through the team. German reinforcements were coming faster than anticipated, drawn by the sounds of battle. Nancy's lookouts signalled frantically. Their marked trucks were racing down the valley road, their headlights cutting through the darkness, replacing the searchlights they had just disabled. Nancy armed the charges with steady hands, her mind calculating timing and escape routes. The train was due in 40 minutes, but the German reinforcements would arrive in less than 5. They had to finish the job and get out before the valley became a killing ground. The first German patrol arrived just as Nancy's team was climbing out of the railway cutting. Machine gun fire erupted from the darkness, tracer rounds streaming across the valley like deadly fireflies. Nancy's fighters responded with disciplined volleys, their weapons speaking in the harsh language of war. The battle was fierce but brief. Nancy's people had the advantage of prepared positions and an intimate knowledge of the terrain. They moved like ghosts through the darkness, striking and withdrawing, using every boulder and tree for cover. The Germans, arriving piecemeal and disorganized, would not coordinate an effective response. Through the chaos of battle, Nancy heard a sound that would make her blood freeze. The whistle of an approaching supply train. It was early, arriving ahead of schedule just as the firefight reached its peak. If the train reached the damaged section of track before the charges were detonated, the mission would fail, and potentially dozens of resistance fighters would die for nothing. Nancy made a decision. Rather than wait for the train to reach the charges, she would detonate them immediately, while the locomotive was still approaching. The explosion would be less effective, but it would ensure that the train could not pass. Her fingers hovered over the detonator as she calculated distances and timing. The blast lit up the valley like a miniature sun, the shockwave knocking men off their feet and shattering windows for miles around. When the smoke cleared, Nancy saw that her mission had succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. The railway line was gone, replaced by a smoking crater that had swallowed a quarter-mile of track. The supply train, arriving at full speed, had no time to stop. The locomotive ploughed into the crater and derailed spectacularly, its cars folding like an accordion behind it, in a tangle of twisted metal and scattered cargo. The German reinforcements, bound for Normandy, would not reach the battle. Nancy's team withdrew into the forest as German reinforcements flooded the area. They had accomplished their mission, but at a cost. 3 fighters had been killed in the battle, and several others were wounded. The price of victory was always measured in blood, and Nancy felt the weight of every life lost under her command. The message to London was brief but triumphant. Rail line destroyed, train derailed, mission accomplished. But Nancy reminded herself that this was just one battle in a much larger war. The German war machine was vast and resilient, and it would take many more such victories to bring it to its knees. Nonetheless, the White Mouse had struck again, proving that even the most heavily defended targets could be destroyed by courage, skill, and determination. Liberation came to the Auvergne in August 1944. The German forces, their supply lines severed by months of sabotage, their morale shattered by constant harassment, finally abandoned their position and fled eastward. Nancy Wake stood in the main square of Montluçon, watching as French tricolours replaced Nazi banners and collaborators were dragged from their hiding places, as a nation began to settle accounts with its dark past. The victory celebration was bittersweet. Nancy's marquee fighters, hardened by months of forest warfare, found themselves suddenly transformed into heroes of the liberation. They marched through the streets to the cheers of crowds who had been forced to hide their true feelings for 4 long years. But Nancy knew the cost of their triumph. Dozens of her fighters had died. Hundreds more bore wounds that would never fully heal. The official commendations came thick and fast. The George Medal from Britain, the Médaille de la Résistance from France, the Medal of Freedom from the United States, each one recognizing Nancy's extraordinary courage and leadership. She had become one of the most decorated women in military history, her exploits already passing into legend. But personal victory remained elusive. Nancy returned to the house she had shared with Henri Fiocca, only to find it empty, ransacked by the Germans during their retreat. The neighbours told her what she had already guessed. Henri had been arrested by the Gestapo, tortured for information about the resistance network, and executed when he refused to betray his wife's activities. The pain of Henri's death was almost unbearable. Nancy had known the risks when she chose to fight, had accepted that her actions might cost her everything, but the reality of that loss was different from its anticipation. The man who had supported her transformation from socialite to resistance fighter was gone, killed because he had refused to save himself by betraying her. France held too many ghosts for Nancy to remain. The country she had fought to liberate was rebuilding itself, but she could not rebuild her shattered life among the ruins of her past. She applied for a position with the British military government in Germany, hoping that the new challenges might help her forget the price of victory. Post-war Germany was a wasteland of rubble and despair. Nancy worked with displaced persons, helping to reunite families torn apart by war, processing the endless stream of refugees who had lost everything in the collapse of the Third Reich. The work was important, but it could not fill the void left by Henri's death. In 1957, Nancy emigrated to Australia, returning to the country of her birth after decades of absence. She married an old friend, John Forward, and tried to build a normal life far from the battlefields of Europe. But the ghosts of the past followed her across the Pacific, and she found it impossible to forget the war that had defined her. The Australia of the 1950s was not ready for Nancy Wake. Her war stories were too dramatic, too violent for polite society. Women were expected to be wives and mothers, not decorated combat veterans. Nancy found herself relegated to the role of curiosity, invited to dinner parties to regale guests with sanitized versions of her exploits. The world moved on, but Nancy remained frozen in time. The Cold War replaced the Hot War, new conflicts erupted in Korea and Vietnam, but the woman who had once been the Gestapo's most wanted fugitive was now just another suburban housewife with an unusual past. The White Mouse had been caged by peace. In her later years, Nancy began to write about her experiences, trying to capture the reality of resistance warfare for a generation that had never known occupation. Her autobiography, The White Mouse, became a bestseller. But even success felt hollow. No amount of recognition could restore the people she had lost, or the life she might have lived if the world hadn't gone mad. Nancy Wake died in London in 2011, aged 98, one of the last survivors of the SOE. Her funeral was attended by representatives of the governments she had served, by historians who had studied her exploits, by admirers who had read her books. But the people who really mattered, Henri, the fighters who had died in the Auvergne, the airmen she had helped escape, were already waiting for her on the other side of memory. The party girl who had become a warrior, the socialite who had become a killer, the woman who had defied every convention of her time, Nancy Wake had lived a life that few could imagine, and still fewer could endure. She had been the White Mouse, and in that role, she had helped to save the world from itself. The hunt was finally over. Well then, there you have it. If you've watched this far and like what you've heard, then consider liking and subscribing. Also, you can hit the notification bell if you want to be notified of future stories. I release a new one every Sunday. As a new channel, this really helps not only push these stories in front of more of you lovely people, but helps reassure me I'm not just sending these off into the ether, never to be seen again. If you've listened this far and don't like what you've heard, then, what on earth are you doing? Right then, off you pop. Thanks for listening.